I want to start by saying this. I think two things are certain and have been exposed dramatically during the pandemic. First, that governments have failed to effectively implement the right to housing, all the way up to the pandemic and well through the pandemic. And we know this because if the right to housing had been taken seriously and integrated into legislative and policy making, we would not see widespread homelessness, including for particular groups of people, which is a prima facie violation. We would not see the rise of informal settlements without basic services like water and sanitation, which constitutes a violation of the right to housing. We would not see the world's urban population living in unaffordable rental housing, fearful of and subject to eviction, a violation of human rights. We would not see people being forcibly evicted into homelessness, a violation of human rights. And we would not see governments facilitating high finance so that it can mine housing and home of its value. And the second thing that I am certain of is that governments have not been held accountable for the misery and inequality they have created through their unswerving commitment to a neoliberal agenda, which has played itself out acutely in the area of housing and residential real estate. And I want to be clear that governments haven't just allowed the financialization of housing to happen unregulated. They haven't just supported it through law and policy. And they haven't just granted high finance, undue political advantage and persuasion. They have, in fact, based their entire economies and governance structures in the financialization of housing. So, in the face of all of this, what does a rights-based approach offer? I have 5 points. First, homelessness, living under bridges on the pavements, eviction and forced eviction from your home, from your lands, from your culture, grossly inadequate housing, lacking basic services. All of these phenomenon challenge dignity, challenge well-being, and challenge human life itself. These are human rights matters and therefore demand human rights responses. So, I mean, it would be unthinkable that we would treat other human rights matters in a way that didn't have a human rights response. We need to start doing that with respect to housing, and that in and of itself is a value added. I think human rights change tenants, dwellers, residents from beneficiaries of charity at best or criminals at worst into rights holders. So when a community is formed along a railway because they have nowhere else to live, or a tent is pitched on a sidewalk, through human rights, we see these and understand these as rights claims by human rights defenders. And that changes then policy and legislative talk and action. Officials, government officials suddenly become responsible for implementing human rights. That becomes their chief role. Third, human rights require the meaningful participation of communities in decisions that affect their lives. And I mean, frankly, this just makes for better decision-making, and it makes for more peaceful and happy societies. That may sound charming, but I think it's true. If you look around the world at all the protests, all the people taking to the streets prior to the pandemic in particular, but even during the pandemic, so much of that is based in the fact that people are not being listened to by their governments, including about their housing conditions. Human rights-based housing strategies include accountability mechanisms. It's a requirement of a human rights-based housing strategy, and that to me is one of the real strengths. There are standards that attach to the right to housing that governments must meet. Every housing and finance decision taken should come under human rights analysis. how does it move forward the right to housing of marginalized populations? And there must be venues, as the previous speaker said, for rights holders to go where they can hold their governments accountable. And in fact, just show governments what is required in order for them to enjoy their human rights. And lastly, I'll say that I think the human rights framework, and it's a framework that actually does inform the SDGs, is quite unique for having as its central goal the pursuit of equality. We have seen starkly through COVID just how unequal the world really is. I read in Forbes magazine recently, in the last year, we have seen a new billionaire created every 17 hours, 500 new billionaires during the pandemic. At the same time, the World Bank anticipates an additional 150 million people will be living in extreme poverty, newly living in extreme poverty. The implementation of human rights across sectors and through human rights-based legislation and policy is the correction to inequality. A lot of people are talking right now about the new social contract, a new social contract. And I like those discussions, but any new social contract would have to be based in human rights. Thank you.
Leilani, that's so helpful to break it out like that. I'm wondering if you could say just a word in your experience. Are you seeing the SDG agenda as something that's opening the way for advancing that type of a human rights-based approach? Or how are you seeing the SDGs in that space?
No. One thing that's really interesting is local governments that I'm working with are really apprised of the SDGs, and they are taking the SDGs quite seriously. But the very worrying thing that we all know about the pursuit of the SDGs, especially now with this depression, economic depression and recession that we're in, is that private capital is going to be required. That's what governments are saying. Private capital is going to be required in order to actually meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 or thereafter. And in the housing sector, that's a complete disaster. I mean, that's the body of work I've been dealing with, which is private equity, pension funds, private monies invading the housing landscape, having no regard for human rights and the human right to housing, and really putting so much pressure on on housing systems that really ending up in many multiple violations of the right to housing. So I am very disturbed by the way the SDGs are being approached, and this sort of natural inclination to look for private money to make it happen. Governments claim they're poor. The one thing the pandemic has shown is that governments can print money. They're printing money. They're just printing money, and so we need some pushback. I just will say one more thing. I noticed that President Biden, in his infrastructure bill, has said that he will not extend monies to private equity to help with the building of infrastructure in the United States, which includes housing and housing supports. And people are critiquing him. Oh, that's a 1970s and 1980s style of infrastructure. But I completely admire it. I think he's right to say governments can do infrastructure, and we will do infrastructure without private equity. It's a good sign.